I'd like to start out by saying that Virginia tops the list of states or commonwealths that produced the most US presidents. We've got not one, not two, we've got 8 presidents who were born in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That is a distinction. And I am delighted to welcome local historian, archaeologist, and author Patrick O Neill, who's going to give us a virtual tour of these presidential residences. Patrick is a member of the Burke Historical Society, and he's president of the Northern Virginia chapter of the Archaeological Society of Virginia. In 2014, Patrick was awarded the Fairfax Heritage Award by the Fairfax County History Commission. He was recognized for his outstanding work preserving, promoting, and protecting the history of Fairfax County. And the recognition included the 13 years that he spent researching and writing a treatise called To Annoy or Destroy the Enemy, the Battle of the White House and the Burning of Washington, that revealed new insights into the connections between events that happened in Fairfax County and the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. Patrick speaks widely on a broad range of historical subjects, including some Arlington history. And for those of you who joined early, you may have witnessed me trying to entice Patrick to return to discuss the Long Bridge over the Potomac or other topics. I'm very excited about this program, and I am really thrilled that Patrick has joined us. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Patrick O Neill.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Before I start and put my PowerPoint up, I want you to think inside your head, there are 8 men that were born in Virginia that became presidents of the United States. And my first slide has all of them on it. So that's why I'm hesitating to put it up. I want you to think if you can figure out who they are. First one, George Washington. Okay, that's a no-brainer. Second one, Thomas Jefferson. Third one is James Madison. The fourth one is James Monroe. The fifth one is William Henry Harrison. The sixth one is John Tyler. The seventh one is Zachary Taylor. And the last one is the most surprising out of all of those so far, is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was born in Virginia. So now I'm going to share the screen because I'll begin my talk. So as I said, there are 8 men that were born in Virginia that became presidents of the United States. Ohio makes the comment that they are the mother of presidents, but that's a little bit misleading because not all of those men that ran from Ohio were born in Ohio, and namely would be William Henry Harrison. He ran from Ohio, but he was not born in Ohio. So Virginia, without question, at this juncture in our history, has the most men who were born president. Okay, now we'll go on from there. These are the birthplaces and major residences of those men. Now, except for Woodrow Wilson, all of them were born before the Civil War and into the 18th century in colonial Virginia. So that's why the majority of them are in the center or the eastern part of the state where they lived, because that's the only area that was developed at that time. But this doesn't have every place where they lived. This is the major residence where they're at. If they lived in a house for a couple of years, it wasn't that important. Now, I will say this, in the background, there is some rumbling. There's a storm going overhead. So if you hear that, I don't know, maybe wherever you're at, you'll hear that too, but we'll go on. The first one, George Washington. And as Harry Lee said, he's first in our hearts, first in our minds. He was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And George Washington was born on Pope's Creek in southeast Virginia in Westmoreland County in 1732. Now, the image at the top is a drawing of the foundation that's shown in the lower left. And this was excavated down at his birthplace. The lower right image shows an outline on the surface of that foundation. And they believe very strongly that that indeed is the structure that was there where George Washington was born. Now, in that lower image on the right, in the very far background on the right, is a red brick building. And that is what they erected for his bicentennial back in 1932, because they wanted to have a place for George Washington's birthplace. But it's a good thing they built it over there, because they didn't know where the original foundation was, so they could go do archaeology later. So that building is not in its correct location, nor does it even look correct, but that's okay. That's why we do archaeology, and that foundation is still there. Now, George Washington's boyhood home, he had come up to the Mount Vernon area when he was 2 years old. His father built the first part of the house, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But then when he's 8 years old, the family moves to Fredericksburg on the opposite side of the Rappahannock from Fredericksburg. And this is a painting done around 1830. And the ruins on the bottom right are supposed to be the remnants of Washington's house. It's called his boyhood home. And then you can see across the river is where Fredericksburg is, and the bridge that goes across the Rappahannock. So the question was whether or not that really was the ruins of Washington's boyhood home. They did archaeology about 20 years ago, and they found the basement and cellar and foundation of a house. And they believe very strongly that this indeed was the house that they called his boyhood home. He lives here from when he was about 8 until he's 19 or 20. And they found that right where that was going down on the slope, rebuilt it. It's a nice structure, beautiful location, and that's trying to recreate this image here with what it looks like today, right on the edge of that slope. And this is a downslope looking up to that boyhood home. And then we come to Mount Vernon. George Washington's father built the original structure at Mount Vernon about 1734, and this is it right here. George Washington is 2 years old at the time. Now, George's great-grandfather is the one that got the original patent of the property, but he does not build there. Grandfather inherits that land, he doesn't build there. And his father is born down on the Potomac River in Westmoreland County. He gets married, has kids. His first wife dies. His father remarries, and then George is born. And that's when they come up here to the Mount Vernon area. But it's not called Mount Vernon at that time. George Washington's father dies when George is around 8 years old, 9 years old. And his older half brother Lawrence gets the property and becomes George's father image. And then Lawrence dies. George inherits the house, and he builds up the second floor and a very tall third floor. It's still a half story, but it's that size. And that's the way the house looked when he gets married to Martha Custis, a widow with 2 surviving children. And over the next 15 years, they build out on the right and left and up above in a full basement. That house is 11,500 square feet. It is huge by today's standards. It was ginormous, as my daughter likes to say, for the 18th century. And this is the structure that you know today. One of the more surprising things about this house more than anything else is that George Washington has the house built, not the porch on the back, not the piazza, but the top image. It is framed out and all there at the beginning of the American Revolution. So before he's general and before he's president, he has the house and most of the outbuildings built like you see today. And it's extraordinary. He and Martha were going to be on top in the area in the social ladder, but they had no idea where they were going to end up, and they had no idea how they were going to get there. And I think that's very interesting that that house is built that huge. And you can see the details on the front and on the back, and that's wood cut to look like stone and then painted, and sand is thrown on the paint to make it look and feel like sandstone. That was his original idea. And in the last couple of years ago, they've been one wall at a time, been scraping off the paint and finding out 83 to 85% of those exterior walls are still the original pine walls. Inside, there's a huge central stairwell and a central hallway. The new room at the bottom is what the ballroom actually is. And this is the formal parlor where they had all the important and influential people meet, similar to like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry. And recently, in the last 2 years, they've added chairs. These blue chairs are reproductions of the ones that their neighbors, the Fairfaxes, had purchased. And when they went back to Great Britain in 1774, they give this fancy furniture to the Washingtons, and they put it in their fancy parlor. The sofa that's part of that set was supposed to be the first sofa ever in the colony of Virginia. And this is a plan of what Washington's farm looked like, drawn by Vaughan in the 1790s. Shows the two big gardens, the huge road around the Bowling Green, the outbuildings that bordered the house, the circle in front of the house, and the mansion itself. And there's the Potomac River at the top. Now, off to the side, something that is been brought to surface in the last 25 years in particular is the enslaved community at Mount Vernon. This is the greenhouse. These single row brick buildings adjacent to the greenhouse are where the enslaved single people lived. And then they also were accompanied with these wood frame buildings off on a side, log structures where families of the enslaved lived. Now, between George and Martha Washington, by the end of their lives, there were 319 enslaved people out at Mount Vernon on 8,000 acres. George Washington had 123. Martha had 153 through the Custis estate, and they were renting 30 from a neighbor farm. George Washington releases his from bondage through his will after his death. Martha cannot do that because she has to keep them. They are Custis enslaved through her husband's estate, so they go to her grandchildren. But that's what happens to the enslaved at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson, president number 2, born in Virginia. He's born at a place called Shadwell, and there's the foundation they found up above. And Shadwell was where his father and mother lived, and he has a couple of siblings, and that's where he was born. And then when he gets a prominence, but still before he writes the Declaration of Independence, he's rising up in Virginia politics and studies, and he already has an early concept of Monticello, as you'll see at the bottom. Now, that early concept of Monticello was a double-decker. Now, it seems very foreign, but they actually know now from doing a lot of work up in the upper part of the current Monticello that they realize he indeed did build this version of Monticello, the top version there. But he takes it down because it's too much for him to handle. So he takes it down and then finishes off the first floor a little nicer. He takes off that whole second floor. But it's hard to comprehend Monticello not looking like the back of the nickel. But that double story was indeed there. So when he and his wife were first married, Martha, and they're living over in this area over here, That's the only building that was built, and then they build the rest of Monticello afterwards. And that's what it looks like, and that's the version, and that's the size sign that was put on the back of the nickel. He loves different things, and he was obsessed with octagonal rooms and octagonal buildings. And so this shows the floor plan. You can see the buildings in here. Some are square, but the exterior ones have not quite octagonal, but there are faceted sides. Now, George Washington never visited Monticello, so we don't know whether he would like it or not, but I think he would have thought that was kind of silly for him to make those not square walls. Lots of windows to let in light from many angles. And this is Thomas Jefferson's bedchamber here, bed in the middle where you can get out on either side. Now, this part is not constructed until after he's widowed. To be fair to Martha, his wife, when she passed away, Jefferson built this because we don't know whether she would have liked having a bedroom in the middle of the room like that. But these alcoves for beds were what he had to do because he made the rooms very small. Now, in the basement, they excavated in the last few years, and they wanted to find out if they could find more information on Sally Hemings, the enslaved woman that Thomas Jefferson had a relationship with and fathered several children by her. And so today in the basement, they have this exhibit. They don't show drawings, they show silhouettes because they're trying to show, they do not know exactly what Sally Hemings looked like, but by doing this, it leads the person to have use their imagination and for what they cannot show. But it's quite nice, and they believe very strongly that indeed is where Sally Hemings lived in the house. So the land itself around Monticello, they are recreating what they called Mulberry Row. Mulberry Row was a row, is access to the structure itself, the house, but they were buildings where the enslaved people lived and also where they worked. And so they're reconstructing these buildings on the side. This is a concept of what some of the slave quarters looked like. Then there's also Poplar Forest. Poplar Forest is his summer home, and it was probably one of his finest architectural achievements. It is really pushing the octagon to its maximum efficiency. You can see in the upper part, the outside of the house, you can see the floor plan on the lower right here with octagonal rooms, the octagonal shape itself of the building. And so they are restoring it painstakingly to make sure that it looks as close as it can to Jefferson's ideals, because they consider that his masterpiece. And I do not believe it is open to the public yet, but you can get tours of it. I know if you go down there and contact them, you can get tours to look at the architecture. It's probably got one of the more interesting outhouses. This is an outhouse in the bottom right. That's pretty fancy for the day. Even today, that would be considered a fancy outhouse. But that's Jefferson. He's usually over the top. President number 3, born in Virginia, James Madison. James Madison was born at his grandmother's house, that's down at Port Conway, and that's no longer existent because that part of the river, they believe, has eaten away at the bank, and that the actual foundation where his grandmother's house was, is actually collapsed into the river. So there's no way we can do any archaeology on that. But his mother and father were living at Mount Pleasant, and that's on the same property where Montpelier is today. And that's an inset of his mother and father. And at the bottom is a painting of what Mount Pleasant would have looked like. So Mount Pleasant, his mother and father and those Madison kids grew up there. And then in 1763, his father built the first phase of Montpelier, and that's shown at the top. Now, he dies, and James Madison is serving in the Washington administration. He has already framed the Constitution. It's been ratified, and George Washington is serving his second term as president. And in 1794, James Madison expands Montpelier to the image that's in the middle. They build off to the one side of the original structure, make two entrances, build a beautiful portico on the front with columns. And then in 1810, just as Madison is being elected president of the United States, he builds on two side wings with basements, and that includes expanding the kitchen as well. And that was the extent of the house at Montpelier. And at the top is the first photograph that can be found of the front. The bottom, the first earliest photograph that can be found at the bottom. These two images here are life masks of James Madison and his wife Dolly, and they're the most accurate productions of what they looked like. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington all died before photography, so there are no photographs of those people. Now, the DuPont family purchased Montpelier, and they built on it like you wouldn't believe. You can see at the top exactly how much they built onto it. They actually stuccoed over the bricks on the outside of the original structure that James Madison had finished, and it was almost a pink color for many years. I haven't shown those color photographs because I want people to remember it like this and not the way that the DuPont family did it. But they got a lot of money to bring it back and restore it to its current condition, which was almost exactly the way it was when the Madisons were living there. So all of that stuff outlined in that top image was taken off. And they found, surprisingly, that still a lot of the original framework was still there. And the lower left here shows you when they removed some of the stuff, the original walls were still there, and they show brickwork, they show flooring, roofing, and some of the walls. So you can see, and on the bottom right, they actually found some wallpaper in a rat's nest. And so they were able to recreate some of that. These three rooms were I took these pictures before they put furniture back in the house. And this shows you to the detail that they restored it to the way the Madisons had it. And here it is on the bottom right in its restored glory. But to add to that story, just like at Mount Vernon and Monticello, Montpelier is restoring the enslaved quarters that were there. Now, the enslaved quarters at Montpelier were off to the side, and they were a little more or a little less glamorous than they were at Mount Vernon and Monticello. That doesn't mean that they were treated any better or worse. It's just that the structures are all wood and not partially brick, except for the foundations. That's what I mean when I say that. But it's nice to see that all three of these founding fathers that were very big in the formation of our country are embracing their past and dealing with the enslaved community, because they would not have been who they were had they not had that enslaved community. Here's a few more pictures here. James Monroe, president number 4, born in Virginia, but president number 5 in the number order of the presidents. So the first 5 presidents of the United States, 4 of them were born in Virginia. And so they, in modern times, they kind of refer to them as the Virginia dynasty. James Monroe was born in Westmoreland County, not too far from where George Washington was born. And when James Monroe died, this image appears in a newspaper, as the birthplace of ex-President Monroe, says at the bottom. Well, for many years, they wondered whether or not that was what the house even looked like. It seemed like very bizarre that they went into so much detail showing an addition with the weird roof that they had there. But in the 1930s, Williams and Mary did archaeology out there and found a foundation. And they found a foundation that agreed with the building that you see beside it. A main house with a substantial chimney, but also a cellar and an addition on the other side. So architectural plans were drawn, a model was built, and I thought I had it in here. They have reconstructed it now. I don't know if it's open for tours, but if you go down there, this is just south of Colonial Beach. And so this house has been reconstructed. And so I know it's supposed to be open for tours sometime this summer. But as everything with the pandemic, who knows when they're going to open that up. James Monroe also builds a house over by Charlottesville. Thomas Jefferson wanted James Monroe and James Madison to build their big houses close to him because he wanted to make Charlottesville a philosophical and an intellectual hub and political hub for Virginia, as well as the United States of America. So James Monroe and his wife Martha built a house, and but at the bottom is a drawing of the house. In the middle, this here is the drawing of the house from a fire insurance policy. Archaeology done around the buildings, and if you've ever been to the Highlands, this is the area where the museum is in the house. They did a lot of archaeology around. The red dots means they found artifacts in it that pertain to a structure. They did some archaeology, and sure enough, they found a brick foundation. So now they know where that house was. And it wasn't very substantial, nothing like Montpelier or Monticello or Mount Vernon. But for James Madison, for many years, that was his biggest house that he owned. But he never lived here this long. And that house is outside here. This is the structure I'm going to show you in a minute. For many years was thought to be Monroe's house, but it wasn't. And here's where that foundation was. This building over here for many years was thought to be James Madison's house or James Monroe's house. This is the furnishings inside that house. Most of these were used by the Monroes. The Monroes were in France. They followed in Thomas Jefferson's footsteps. He was an ambassador to France, and his wife Martha bought a lot of furnishings when she was over in Europe and brought those back to their home, and later used that to fill out the White House when they lived in the White House. Here's a foundation showing, or that bricks outlining that foundation of that original Monroe house. But this house for many years was thought to be the original structure, but they realize now this one was built around 1810, where the other one was built around 1800. And so this was probably a guest house that people lived in. And that's the back side of that house. Off to the side, the big building in the middle here, that's the slave quarters, and that's still the original structure. On this side is a work building. On this side is the overseer's house here. And those three buildings have been reconstructed and renovated into their original conditions. But Oak Hill, which is out by Aldie, out west of DC, was truly the dream home of James Monroe. And he didn't get to build that till just as he left office. This is what he wanted to build. All these early presidents thought that they had to still be like royalty, even though they didn't want a monarchy, but they wanted to have a substantial house to show their prominence in society. Madison was Monroe was no different. And this is Oak Hill. This is the floor plan for the first floor. He builds it after his presidency because he didn't want to leave the Washington area. he wanted to stay in the Washington area because finally the home, the seat of government had moved there by 1800 when John Adams moved into the president's house. And so he didn't want to live down by Charlottesville where Jefferson was living and Madison was living. So he built this home west of DC at Oak Hill. That's a picture of his wife in the upper right. Sadly, Martha fell into one of the fireplaces one day and got severely burned and died about a year later because of her injuries. This is a color shot of Oak Hill in the 1930s. There's a death mask of James Monroe on the left. We don't have a photograph of him. And this is his grave and mausoleum down at the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. I took that picture with the cherry blossoms. That was just beautiful. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison is born in Berkeley in Charles City County. His father was Benjamin Harrison, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And of all the people that became president of the United States listed in this book, Benjamin Harrison or William Henry Harrison was probably born into the more substantial of them. The Harrisons have been in Virginia for some time, and this is Berkeley right here. Inside Berkeley, there is a stone in there, Benjamin Harrison, 1726. And so they've kept it when they renovated the house. Inside this, they originally had wood paneling and was replaced with plaster in the early 1800s. It is still a residence. Someone lives upstairs, but the downstairs and the grounds are open to the public for tours. Substantial boxwood gardens leading down to the James River. This is a view here. This is the mansion up here, and you look down to the James River down below. So William Henry Harrison was born at Berkeley, but then he moved away as a young man, especially when he becomes military. And when he runs for president, he is living in Ohio. The image on the right here is a daguerreotype, and I believe that it is the first photograph of a living president, that it had to be taken on Inauguration Day in 1841. Someone purchased a pitch photograph of John Quincy Adams a couple of years ago and touts that as the first president, the earliest photograph of a president. It is the earliest photograph of a president that preceded William Henry Harrison, but that photograph of John Quincy Adams was taken about a year after I think this one was taken. So I'm still promoting it. Can't get on one of those museum shows trying to have somebody come and put this on a public stage. But I'm telling you, and the people at Virginia Department of Historic Resources believe me as well, this is the earliest photograph of any president of the United States. John Tyler. So William Henry Harrison dies in office after just 30 days, and John Tyler assumes the presidency because he was vice president at the time. John Tyler was born at Greenway, which is in Charles City County. Charles City County is where William Henry Harrison, his predecessor, was born as well. This house still stands. Later, Tyler and his first wife went a second structure called Woodburn. That structure no longer survived. Then he becomes president after William Henry Harrison dies. They called him the accidental president because he stumbled into it being president. He was not voted in. They weren't sure exactly constitutionally whether or not it would happen. But Tyler said, you know, this is the way it needs to happen. And the Supreme Court sided on his side. And so Tyler stayed in assumed the presidency, was sworn in, but he did not win re-election. But while he's at the White House, his first wife dies. Then he purchases a house in Charles City County called Walnut Grove, and he renamed it Sherwood Forest because when he became president, he switched parties so he could keep the government together. So he became an outlaw, really, within his own party. And so if he was an outlaw, then he was going to call his home Sherwood Forest, because that's where Robin Hood, the outlaw, lived, was in Sherwood Forest. This is a picture of his second wife, Julia Gardner, who he married while he was in the White House after his first wife died. The wings on the big house are very long, and it makes it the longest wooden structure in the state of Virginia. Now, the one, as you're looking at the front, this part to the right was built specifically. So his wife loved the Virginia reel. So she had it built specifically so they could dance the Virginia reel inside. So this is Harrison Tyler, John Tyler's grandson, and I'll talk about him in just a second. He's pointing to the vaulted roof in that addition. The band or orchestra or 5-piece quartet, whatever it was, 4-piece quartet, they stayed at one end and they played music, and the arched ceiling was supposed to bounce the music across, and the Virginia reel, people would dance back. If you remember what the Virginia reel is, it's kind of like a line dance. Okay, so this can accommodate the entirety of a Virginia reel, and that's why it was built that way. Now, Harrison Tyler here. Harrison Tyler is the grandson of John Tyler. He's still alive. John Tyler was born in 1790. He was president from 1841 to 45. So his grandson is still alive. John Tyler was in his 60s when he had Harrison's father, or when his wife had Harrison's father. Harrison's father was in his 60s when Harrison was born, and now Harrison is close to 90 years old. So a grandson of a president that was born in 1790, he and his brother still are alive, and that's pretty amazing. This is other things inside of Sherwood Forest here, mementos from the Tyler family, and it's still a residence. Harrison and his wife still live upstairs. As they renovated, one of the things that Harrison wanted me to put in my book is this little image here. It looks like a girl, and supposedly they heard ghost sounds coming up and down that staircase. And here, when they took the wallpaper off, this is what was left behind. So they always had a good ghost story there. They left it just like that when they repainted it. Zachary Taylor, president number 7, born in Virginia. Zachary Taylor, out of all the people we're talking about today, has the shortest time in Virginia. He was born at Monticello, and that's where these people, these two men at the top are looking. They're looking at the foundation of what they think is Monticello. There's a sign out there and a marker. But Zachary Taylor moves away from Virginia, less than a year old, and his family moves to Kentucky. He dies on not on July 4th, but on July 9th. Now, I say that because Thomas Jefferson from Virginia dies on July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. That same day, John Adams dies. The second and third presidents die on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. James Monroe from Virginia dies on July 4th, 1831. James Madison was going to possibly die on July 4th. About a week before, Dolly says, "You're coming up to the July 4th. Do you think that you can last long enough to die on July 4th? Because 3 presidents already had died on July 4th. And Madison didn't think he could make it. He dies just before July 4th. And here's Zachary Taylor. He is partying on July 4th and eats too many, they believe he ate too many cherries and got sick. He got gastritis. And so he dies on July 9th because of things he ate on July 4th. So something about being born in Virginia, becoming president, and dying on July 4th, I guess. I don't know. Last man to be born in Virginia that has become president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. This is the priest's or the minister's house from the Presbyterian Church in Staunton, Virginia. And Tommy Wilson, because he's Thomas Woodrow Wilson, Tommy Wilson was born in this rectory and lived here for just a couple of years before his family moved away. But this house has been renovated and is now a museum, and it is dedicated to the fact that Woodrow Wilson was born there. And the World War I Research Center is next door. Now here you can see it in the top picture. You can see the white columns of the manse there behind the church that his father was minister at. And that's where they lived back behind there. His mother and father in the lower right, and the lower left. The lower left is his mother and father. The lower right is inside the house. The baby bed that he grew up, he was born in and placed after he was born, is in the house. That guitar is his mother's, and that is the bed that he was born on in the same room as the crib. Woodrow Wilson, on his way to Washington, D.C. to be sworn in and become president of the United States, stops through Stanton on his way through, and he is in front of his birthplace house at the top and on the right here. And the town threw a big celebration, because even though he was only there a couple of years, you got a native born son going to become president of the United States, you got to hoop it up, And so that is the end of my presentation. So if anybody has some questions, I don't see any in the chat. You're welcome to write some questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute and you can ask a question to me here.
Well, we have a comment. Oh, here's a question. Oh, now a bunch
Okay.
of questions. Okay, good.
Oh, how many had wives named Martha? Okay. If I understand correctly, only George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe, three of these had, I don't know if any other presidents had names of Martha. I'll have to look into that. I hadn't really thought about that. But out of these men, only, I guess three, I guess that's almost 30% had wives named Martha. But Martha Washington probably had the best life, because Thomas's first wife, Martha, died at a young age. His daughter, Martha, became the first lady, really, of the White House. And Dolly Madison also helped Thomas Jefferson out with some of those first lady duties. And then James Monroe's wife, Martha, she died after a horrible accident when she got burned in the fire. Well, okay, so it's a person is asking, Mont is used often in the names of these homes. Mont means mountain. Why? Mount. There's high spot. Usually these buildings are built on a high spot, or a place that's a little bit taller. Now, Mount Vernon is on a flat upland surface. So is Montpelier, but they're slightly higher. You can see Mount Vernon from the river. You can see Montpelier as you come up to it, because it's kind of got a swale in front of it. So as you're coming up to it, you can see it on this high spot. His father called it Mount Pleasant. It just became a term to try to bring yourself up a little bit. If you said Mount or Mont, you're a little bit, I guess, higher than those people around you. But that's what. Can you comment on the style of architecture of the earliest presidents? So George Washington is using Georgian architecture, which makes everything symmetrical. Outside is one thing, inside is another. But he's using Georgian architecture, and you can see that in the paneling. You can see that in the exterior. Although if you've ever looked at Mount Vernon from the circle side, not the river side, the circle side, one of two of the windows are off just slightly. And that's when he built up the second story. He puts in a wider staircase And that wider staircase forces him to redo the distance between the door and the windows. And he does that. And so I work out at Mount Vernon. And so one of the things we say out there is that there's a difference between Georgian architecture and Georgian Washington architecture. It still looks close, but nobody's going to go up to the old man and tell him they don't like it. It still looks fine. I don't think anybody's ever complained when they went up there, oh, this house is ugly. That one window is off by 1.5 feet. If you go to the piazza, the windows have not been moved because that's not where the staircase is. But his is built before the presidency, okay? And I say that because, and John Adams up in New England, his is built before the presidency. Thomas Jefferson is the one, he and James Madison are the one reason I'm talking separately. They truly have the new federal period, okay? Thomas Jefferson brings in Roman and Greek architecture heavily into the design of Richmond, the state capital, and Williamsburg, and the new city in Washington. And so it's no different in his house. He kind of becomes obsessed with octagons. I have never quite figured out where the octagon came from because the Greeks and Romans don't do octagons, but somehow he gets hooked up. But his is totally that Greek revival, that Romanesque stuff. And so he brings that to the United States of America, and that's what they call the federal period, because the federal buildings, the federal government is being built. And so the style that Jefferson brings in with the triangular pediments above the doors and with the columns and all of that and the doorways, that's federal period. So that's Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and when Madison is fixing up Montpelier, Jefferson has given him ideas. Then the rest of them, William Henry Harrison, he's living in a house his dad built like George Washington's. It's got some interesting items in it, but that's Georgian architecture, not the Greek and Roman revivals. And then the rest of them, Tyler and Woodrow Wilson and Zachary Taylor, they're just, they don't have anything that they built. So they didn't build the structures that they lived in Virginia themselves. Okay. What led you to your interest in this historical subject? Okay. So I'm an archaeologist and a historian by profession. And when I was doing archaeology, I became the historian out at Fort Belvoir for 2 years, 2001 and 2002. And while out there, Images of America by Arcadia Press, and you've probably seen dozens of these books around, wanted someone to do a book on Mount Vernon. And Mount Vernon, boy, her name, she was the archaeologist out there for many years, and I'm totally blank. I can see her face. But anyway, she told them, call Patrick up. He's the one that you should talk to. He'd do a book. And so I did a book for them for Images of America on Mount Vernon. And then they approached me again and said, well, would you like to do one on all the homes that the Virginia presidents lived in? And I said, sure. So that's how I became involved with that. But as I told Sheila before you guys logged on, I pick up many subjects, and sometimes they're ones that I want to do, and others that someone has asked me, hey, have you ever thought about doing research on this? And I'll pick up a new subject and roll with it. I enjoy doing that. I'm very good at doing research. I would say that that's probably one of my best features, is that I enjoy doing the research and I'm good at it. I've been doing it since I was in high school. And that says a lot, because that's pre-computer, as most of you out there can appreciate. Being able to do good detailed research in the old days when you didn't have a camera to take pictures of things, that was tough. We can all appreciate that. Karen, thank you for your kind words. Montpelier is from France. I do not know how James Madison or his father came up with the word Montpelier, but I know his father is the one that called the new house Montpelier. The old one off to the side where the cemetery is was Mount Pleasant. So his father already had a concept. He was changing his own image when they built that new brick structure, but I don't know where he got that. I'll look into it, but I don't remember if I ever read where he came up with it. Oh, okay. So Steve is on here. Hello, Steve. So you and Karen went down to Tyler's house. You might have met Harrison Tyler. If it was 20 to 30 years ago and it was a older gentleman, it was probably Harrison. I talked to him 15 years ago, and he was very, very strong and with it then. So it's very possible that you actually talked to his grandson, the one I was talking about, because he's the one that lives there. If it was an older person, it was probably him. No, Zachary Taylor's family lived in Kentucky. He served in the war of the Mexican-American War. And so Taylor's down in Mexico. And that's why a lot of people think he's down there, but I don't believe he lived down there. He is stationed down there in Mexico during the war. He's fighting, and that's what rises him to fame. It is possible he lived in Texas in one of the forts, but I'm off the top of my head, I'm not aware of that. Oh, so Karen does say that it was probably, I believe that was Harrison Tyler who they met. It sounded like for all of the earlier presidents here, they were often designing their own house or additions. Was formal training in architecture just part of the standard education for men of their class? No, they are invoking other people. They're going to find the person who's going to build it for them. George Washington designed his, but that's just because of who he was. He wasn't really good at it. So that's why you don't have Monticello at Mount Vernon. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't nice. He designs what he wants, and then the woodworker comes in and says, I can do this for you. Or Washington might say, you know, that house in Williamsburg, I want it to look something like that. And he would tell him that. So it kind of evolves around it. Now, Jefferson, again, he's over the top. Okay. He's going to do everything because that's Jefferson. And he's going to shoot down whatever you like unless it looks better than his. And then it'll become his idea. It won't be your idea. I'm not trying to beat him up, but his mind is thinking a lot different than anybody else's. And that's why he tore down that huge Monticello, made it smaller because he wanted something different. You know, most everybody else would have had only enough money to just do it once. And he didn't really have that much money. He kept borrowing. That's why him and Madison were in debt at the end of their life. But as far as I know, no, they're not learning. I mean, they might know some basic things when they were studying in college, but as far as I know, it's not any formal training because most of Washington, remember, Washington didn't have that much training. He trained as a surveyor, then he got joined the military, and then he got into the political world. But he was always having to learn on the go. The name of my book is Virginia's Presidential Homes, and that is one of the Images of America series. You can still find it sometimes in the bookstores. Before the pandemic, I had copies at the house, but I've run out. So I'm going to try to get some more now that we're coming out of it. But you can order it from Arcadia Press. If you go to their website, you can order any of the books from Arcadia Press, and they give you a list. I believe they finally decided to have a list by area because there's so many books. People have no idea that there are books. I think there's now over 4,000 titles in the Images of America series. And these are towns, communities, or like in the DC area, themes. They might have World War II in DC. They might have little communities because the communities are in DC. Glen Carlin and Arlington might have its own book. I'm just saying things like that. So there's so many volumes in that book, book series, and they're very good. I often thought that working with Arlington, there's a number of communities. I think I might do one on Arlington House. Now, I did archaeology there about 15 years ago, and I might strike up, or maybe they've already done one on Arlington House. But there's lots of them in there. Take a look at them. You'll enjoy it. And they're very good. They're very good because they're usually done by the people that know what they're talking about. Like the Arlington Historical Society might do one on Arlington County, or they could do it, but it would be the people that would know what they were doing.
Okay, well, it looks like we've come to the end of our time and to the end of the questions in the chat. Unless somebody has anything final, I think we're going to sign off. Okay. I would like to say thank you so very much, Patrick. That was amazing, fascinating, truly superb. I really enjoyed it, and judging from the comments in the chat, I think we all enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you so much for this fabulous presentation. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. Everybody take care, stay well, and we'll see you soon.
All right.
Thanks a lot.